5,000 tilapia were sitting in 3 neglected ponds when everyone decided they were worthless. The water was dark. The pumps barely worked. Feed had stopped coming regularly, and the fish were small enough that most commercial buyers wouldn't even bother weighing them. For months, they had survived almost entirely on whatever they could find in the ponds. Algae, tiny insects, plant matter, anything that could keep them alive. The previous owner had abandoned the farm after his business collapsed. What remained was a property nobody wanted, and thousands of fish nobody believed were worth saving. Then, a widow named Wren Halloway walked into the auction. She wasn't looking for fish. She wasn't even planning to start a fish farm. But when the auctioneer announced that all 5,000 remaining tilapia could be purchased for $600, Wren raised her hand. The room laughed. One farmer called them minnows. Another said they were too small to recover. Garrick Thorne, who ran 3 commercial fish farms in the valley, said the only thing Wren had purchased was a pond full of problems. But nobody noticed what was happening beneath the surface. The fish were still feeding, still moving, still reproducing, and most importantly, they were surviving. 1 year later, farmers would drive for hours to Wren's farm. They wouldn't be asking to buy the fish for dinner. They would be asking for their fingerlings. And the reason would begin with something nobody noticed on that first day. These weren't ordinary survivors. If you like stories of ordinary things becoming extraordinary through patience, hit the subscribe button, like the video, and share it, and tell me where you're watching from in the comments. The abandoned Fenwick Aqua Farm, just outside Millbrook Flats, had once been one of the most productive aquaculture operations in the county. Its ponds were carefully maintained. The water was circulated. Feed was delivered on schedule. Fish were harvested and sold to markets across the region. Then everything collapsed. The owner ran into financial trouble. Employees stopped getting paid. Equipment began breaking down. Feed deliveries stopped. And eventually, the pumps became little more than rusting machinery beside empty buildings. But the fish remained. Thousands of them. When inspectors finally counted the surviving stock, they estimated approximately 5,000 tilapia remained across 3 ponds. They were not impressive. Some were barely market size. Others were smaller. Their growth had been severely stunted. But they were alive. That distinction mattered. At the liquidation auction, potential buyers walked around the ponds. They looked at the muddy water. They looked at the undersized fish. Then they walked away. The economics seemed terrible. Buy the fish. Pay for transportation. Repair the ponds. Repair the pumps. Buy feed. Test the water. Wait months for growth. And there was no guarantee the fish would survive. The auctioneer finally announced the lot. 5,000 tilapia. $600. Silence. Then laughter. Nobody raised a paddle. Except Wren. She raised hers. Garrick Thorne, standing near the front, laughed loudest of all, and said whoever bought that water would be paying for a very expensive way to grow mosquitoes. The auctioneer looked around. 600. No other bidder. The gavel came down. 5,000 fish were hers. Wren stood beside the pond afterward. She watched the water move. Thousands of small bodies disappeared beneath the surface. She didn't know what they were worth. But she knew something everyone else had missed. They had survived the collapse of an entire fish farm, and that meant they had already passed a test, the hardest test of all. Moving 5,000 fish wasn't simple. Wren had no commercial fish transport system. The ponds on her own farm weren't ready. She had to improvise tanks and temporary holding systems. Dr. Otis Vance, a retired aquaculture specialist, agreed to help. His first instruction was simple. Don't rush them. Fish that had lived in neglected water could not simply be dumped into perfectly clean water and expected to thrive. The transition had to be controlled, so Wren moved them gradually. Tank by tank, pond by pond, the fish entered their new environment. For several days, Wren watched them closely. Some died, but most survived. Then something strange happened. The survivors began feeding aggressively. They weren't behaving like weakened fish. They were behaving like fish that had discovered food after a long famine. Wren adjusted the feeding schedule. Small amounts, several times a day. Then, she started recording everything. Water temperature, feeding, growth, mortality, weather, pond conditions. The notebook became a record of the fish themselves, and the more she recorded, the stranger the results became. The fish were growing, not rapidly, but consistently, and the fish that had looked the weakest at the auction weren't necessarily the weakest now. Some were proving remarkably resilient. Otis noticed it too. "Keep watching the ones that survive," he told Wren. "Why? Because survival itself may be telling us something." That sentence changed the entire direction of the farm. Wren stopped asking, "How do I make these fish grow faster?" She started asking, "Why are these fish surviving?" 4 months after the purchase, Wren noticed tiny fish along the edges of one pond. At first, she thought they were insects. Then, she looked closer. Fingerlings. Thousands of them. The original fish were reproducing. Otis came immediately. He examined the pond, then another, then the third. The same thing was happening everywhere. The 5,000 fish weren't simply surviving. They were creating another generation, and that generation appeared to be doing remarkably well. The fingerlings were small, but they were active. They fed aggressively. They tolerated the changing pond conditions. And their numbers kept increasing. Wren began separating the strongest groups, not because she knew exactly what she was doing, but because the records suggested something important. Some families were performing better than others. Otis encouraged her to track them, so Wren began selective breeding. She wasn't trying to create enormous fish. She was looking for something different. Fish that could survive. Fish that could reproduce. Fish that could grow without requiring perfect conditions. That became the experiment. And then came the drought. The summer began hot. Then hotter. Rainfall became irregular. Small streams dried. Farm ponds across the county dropped lower every week. For fish farmers, drought was a nightmare. Less water meant less space. Warmer water meant greater stress. And changing water conditions could quickly cause losses. Other farms began reporting dead fish. Some farmers reduced their stock. Others started selling early. Wren's ponds were shrinking too. The water level dropped. The fish became more concentrated. Otis warned her that the conditions could become dangerous. Wren began hauling water. Day after day, tank after tank. She repaired the old pumps. She installed shade structures. She improved water circulation. But she couldn't create rain. Eventually, one pond reached a dangerously low level. Wren expected the fish to begin dying. Instead, something remarkable happened. The fish adapted their behavior. They concentrated in the deeper sections. They became more active during cooler periods. They fed when conditions were favorable. And the strongest groups continued reproducing. Otis compared the mortality records with those from nearby farms. The difference surprised him. Wren's fish were surviving at a rate that shouldn't have been possible given the conditions. The drought had unintentionally created the experiment nobody had planned. The fish were being tested, and they were passing. Otis wanted answers. Where had these fish originally come from? Why had they survived such neglect? Why were certain groups performing better? Wren returned to the old Fenwick records. Most of the paperwork was gone, but she found a partial shipping document. It contained the name of an old agricultural research program, the Cross River Genetics Program, Blackwater Line. Otis recognized it. Years earlier, researchers had experimented with fish that could maintain productivity under difficult farm conditions. The goal wasn't simply to produce the biggest fish. It was to develop fish capable of surviving changing environments. The program eventually disappeared. The records were incomplete, but suddenly, the 5,000 forgotten tilapia looked different. Maybe they hadn't been worthless commercial leftovers. Maybe they were descendants of a breeding experiment. Maybe their survival wasn't luck. There was only one way to know: genetic testing. The laboratory cost thousands of dollars. Wren didn't have the money. She sold equipment. She delayed improvements to the farm. She used almost everything she had. Then she sent samples. Now came the hardest part: waiting. Word spread through the local aquaculture community. At first, people came because they were curious. Then they came because they had heard rumors. Those are the fish from Fenwick? Those little ones? How many survived? How many fingerlings are they producing? Wren didn't have all the answers, but her records did. The fish were reproducing rapidly. The strongest groups showed excellent survival. Their offspring were performing well in difficult pond conditions, and farmers were beginning to notice something else. They were cheap to maintain compared with some of the commercial stocks they had been using. Garrick Thorne, the wealthy operator who had laughed at Wren's purchase at the auction, finally became interested. He offered her money, first $20,000, then $35,000, then $50,000. But he didn't want the farm. He wanted the fish. More specifically, he wanted the breeding stock. Wren refused. Garrick asked why. She answered honestly, "I don't know what they're worth yet." His expression changed, because he realized something Wren was beginning to understand. The fish weren't valuable because there were 5,000 of them. They were valuable because 5,000 survivors could become the foundation of thousands of future fish. 6 weeks after the samples were submitted, the laboratory results arrived. Otis opened the report. He read it once, then again. Then he called Wren. She drove to his office. What did they find? Otis placed the report on the table. The genetic results showed strong connections to the old research line. The fish carried characteristics consistent with a population selected for resilience and performance under variable conditions. The original 5,000 weren't simply random survivors. They represented a potentially valuable breeding population. But the most important evidence wasn't on the laboratory report. It was in Wren's notebooks. Thousands of observations, months of survival data, reproduction records, growth comparisons, water conditions. The fish had essentially conducted their own demonstration. They had shown what they could do. The same fish that had been dismissed because they were too small had survived neglect. Their offspring had survived drought, and their descendants were multiplying. Now the question wasn't whether they were valuable. The question was, how valuable? Garrick made one final move. He announced that his company intended to purchase the entire breeding population. He offered an enormous amount of money, but he wanted exclusive control. If Wren agreed, every future fingerling would pass through his operation. The fish could become the foundation of a massive commercial breeding program. Wren refused. Then Garrick attacked the credibility of the fish. He claimed the lineage was uncertain. He questioned the records. He suggested the fish had survived only because Wren had been lucky. But Otis had the data, and Priya Sundaram, an independent aquaculture specialist, agreed to inspect the operation. She studied the fish, the ponds, the breeding records, the water data, the laboratory report. She compared the survival rates. Then she reached her conclusion. The fish had demonstrated genuine value, not because they were the biggest, not because they were the prettiest, but because they could survive and reproduce under conditions where other stocks struggled. That was the trait farmers wanted, and suddenly, demand exploded. The first farmer arrived at 6 in the morning. He wanted 10,000 fingerlings. Another arrived before lunch, then another. By the end of the week, vehicles were lining the road outside Wren's farm. Farmers were offering cash, contracts, future percentages. Some wanted exclusive rights. Others wanted enough fingerlings to stock new ponds. But Wren had learned something from the fish. Don't rush. She created a breeding program. The strongest fish would remain in the core population. Fingerlings would be distributed to qualified farmers. Records would follow each group, and no single company would control the entire breeding line. The farmers agreed, because they understood what they were buying. They weren't simply buying young fish. They were buying access to a population that had demonstrated something extremely valuable. resilience. 1 year after the auction, the 3 neglected ponds outside Millbrook Flats looked completely different. The old muddy water was gone. The pumps worked. The ponds were organized. The breeding groups were separated. And beneath the surface were tens of thousands of fish. The original 5,000 had become the foundation of a much larger population. Some had been sold. Thousands of fingerlings had been distributed. And new farmers were raising their own generations. But the most remarkable part was this: the fish that nobody wanted had become the fish everybody wanted. The farmers who once laughed at Wren's $600 purchase now waited for their allocation. They didn't ask, "How much for a fish?" They asked, "How many fingerlings can we get?" And that distinction mattered, because a fish is a product, but a strong breeding population is a foundation. 5,000 forgotten tilapia had entered the story as an unwanted leftover from a failed farm. They emerged as the beginning of something much bigger. Their value had never been obvious. It had been hidden beneath murky water, hidden beneath their small size, hidden beneath months of neglect, and hidden beneath the assumption that anything overlooked must be worthless. But the fish had been telling their own story all along. They had survived the collapse of a farm. They had survived hunger. They had survived poor water conditions. They had reproduced. Their offspring had survived drought. And eventually, they proved something nobody at that auction had understood. The most valuable thing about a fish isn't always how big it is today. Sometimes it's what that fish can pass on to the next generation. And that is why, 1 year after a widow paid just $600 for 5,000 forgotten tilapia, fish farmers weren't laughing anymore. They were standing at her gate, waiting, hoping, and begging for her fingerlings. The property looked completely different to anyone who remembered driving past it that first cold week. It had been renamed Blackwater Aqua Farm, a name that felt earned rather than borrowed. The ponds ran clear, even deep into summer heat that would have turned them green a year earlier. New aeration lines hummed steadily where a failing blower had once nearly cost Wren everything she had. The operation was still modest, still practical, still hers, through every hard decision that had built it. Otis stayed on as a consulting biologist, visiting every few weeks to check the breeding lines. Cyrus ran transport for fingerling deliveries across 3 counties now, his flatbed trailer rarely idle. Dolores helped build a proper genetic record-keeping system tracking every breeding line on the property, the kind of documentation Fenwick had never bothered to maintain. And Milo still kept his water-testing notebook, checking dissolved oxygen every morning before school, the same careful ritual his mother had taught him during that first brutal summer, writing the numbers down in his own careful, uneven hand. On the wall of the equipment shed hung the auction paddle from that first day, a simple wooden number that had once represented what the whole town assumed was the biggest mistake of a widow's life. Wren remembered Garrick telling her he'd own her land by fall. She remembered the crashed oxygen levels, the failed pump, the empty bank account, the threats disguised as concern for community safety. And she remembered Anchor, the fish that had refused to stop pushing toward clean water that first freezing night, still alive. Still one of the strongest breeders in the entire population, still circling the aerator every morning like it was a habit he'd never quite let go of. 5,000 dying tilapia had become the foundation of something much larger than anyone in Millbrook Flats could have predicted that auction day. The farmers who'd once laughed were now asking her for fingerlings by name. The man who thought his money could buy anything had learned, slowly and in front of the whole valley, that some things simply couldn't be purchased outright no matter what number he offered. And Wren had learned something too, something she carried with her every evening she walked the pond edges alone after Milo had gone to bed. She hadn't saved those fish because she wasn't afraid. She'd saved them because she kept making the next decision anyway. One pond, one failed pump, one freezing night at a time, long after it would have been easier to stop. As the sun dropped over the ridge, she stood at the edge of the water and watched the surface ripple with movement that used to terrify her and now felt like proof of everything she'd fought to keep alive. Because on auction day, everyone else had seen dying fish in dirty water. She had seen survivors. And sometimes the difference between failure and fortune isn't what everyone else sees. It's whether you're willing to look twice. If you enjoyed Ren's story, subscribe for more stories of ordinary people who made extraordinary decisions when everyone around them said they were wrong.